Right. Looks like we're ready to get started. How's everybody doing this morning? Good. All right. So we're here this morning to talk about the Office 365 developer patterns and practices. The intent is to get you from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour, and then a little bit beyond that. So I would like to start. How many folks in here know about Office developer patterns and practices? Okay, so just a few. And how many have used it? About the same number. Okay, so you can see that once people know about it, they're highly likely to use it. So that's actually a good thing to see. All right, so we'll jump right in. So my name is Steve Walker. A little bit about me. I am a senior software engineer on the Office 365 Developer Experiences team. We are actually a new team. When you'll also know that we have a Developer Experiences Field Organization, which used to be called DPE, or Developer Platform Evangelist. That is not where I am at. I actually am on the engineering team within the Office organization. I live in Redmond. I was previously a SharePoint CAT, or on the customer advisory team. Before that, I was a SharePoint Ranger. I worked in Microsoft Consulting Services, so I have a pretty long history with SharePoint. And now I'm looking to kind of expand beyond just SharePoint, but also Office and Exchange. Our development story is now across the stack, and so it's quite an exciting time for us SharePointers, because quite a lot of the development customization was kicked out of the Exchange stack a long time ago, and not a lot of Office client development went on before. I mean, some. So it's really an exciting time, so folks with SharePoint skills will be able to kind of take over the whole stack now. So look forward to a lot of new opportunities. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a Sounders FC fan. That's our local football club there in Seattle. I like driving fast cars, going hiking, camping, those types of things. So there's a little bit of contact info if you guys want to get in touch with me after the session, so feel free. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the program. So I think it's kind of enlightening to let you know kind of where this came from. It is much different than the previous Patterns and Practices initiative that was done for SharePoint 2010, for anybody who is familiar with that. While that was architecturally elegant, somewhat difficult to wrap your head around and use some. So I definitely want folks to understand the history here. We're going to give you an overview of what the Patterns and Practices program is. We are going to get started with the resources, so show you what kind of resources are out there to help you get ramped up and where you can learn, where you can ask questions, all of those types of things. And actually how to participate. So this is very different than the Patterns and Practices initiatives before, because we are participating with our community. This is not us in an ivory tower out there in Redmond coming up with how you should do things. This is actually driven from engagements with customers and engagements with the community. And I think because of that, we've seen a lot of uptake with this. And then I will actually go through a couple of sample demos. So it is a 200-level session, so I'm not going to go too deep. But I will show you, at least try to get across the point of how easy it is to really get started and use these samples and start to get your brain around how you could use it. And then I will show you some of the more complex solutions and scenarios that are in Patterns and Practices to give you an idea of the types of things that are in there. So first, we'll start with the history of the program. I have been with this from the beginning. So in the beginning, in 2012, we started this journey. I was actually tasked when I was on the SharePoint customer advisory team when we started our internal dog foods with SharePoint 2013. I was actually on point from the engineering team to work with MSIT to both drive adoption internally on the beta SharePoint 2013, as well as move our SharePoint implementation into Office 365. Okay, so these early dog food efforts, as with any software, you go out into an enterprise and you find out what it doesn't do, and you find out where you're going to have to extend it and where you're going to have to pave over the cracks and seams, right? And we found them, believe me. So this was an internal effort, is where it actually originally began. So we fast forward a little bit into 2013. We started partnering with other MCS teams internally who were working with early adopter customers. So customers who were starting to move their SharePoint implementations into the 2013 space and trying to move over into the app model, or slash we call it the add-in model, I guess now. And so I was actually able to bring those learnings that we had with MSIT and a pocket full of code that we had written and work with some of these internal teams in MCS. So that started what we called a shared source effort. We called it GAPS internally. And we started kind of modeling the open source effort with just our internal Microsoft folks who were doing this type of a work. And we really were focused on the new app model, the add-in model, because of our drive towards Office 365. So you'll see me espouse everything about the app model. Yes, I realize that there are still people who do farm solutions and still people who do sandbox solutions, and I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't in your particular case, right? Obviously, if you're on SharePoint 2010, that's kind of what you have to work with, right? But my focus was really on this model. So we had our first public drop of code in 2014, so there was a lot of interest outside of just inside of Microsoft, right? The customers that we had worked with, those were MCS consultants, they said, hey, we'd like to be able to get to that, right? You know, it's great that you can give us code samples, but we would like to be able to get to that. We'd like to point our internal teams to that. And so the Office AMS project was born. We actually dropped all of our code out there on CodePlex. This is before the Office org decided to use GitHub. AMS means app model samples. The community really liked the approach because we could just add stuff to it really quickly. They would come up with new and novel scenarios. We would add a code sample into it. We would ship it back out there. It was not open source. It was really just code drops, right? We had some legal and compliance issues we had to get through to actually be able to turn it open source, and so that was interesting. Microsoft's a big company, and we have a big team of lawyers who like to make sure that you're not dropping code out there that we might want to license, I guess. So late in 2014, this became the Office Developer Patterns and Practices. So our technical marketing team really ramped up. We got folks like CJ and Arpon and Jeremy Thake. I don't know if you guys know them, but they came on board, and we decided as an org that we were going to use GitHub for all of our open source efforts. And so Patterns and Practices was born. We actually at the same time started working with, we had a pool of Office 365 dedicated customers, and we were looking to move them from the dedicated service that we have today into what's going to be tomorrow, our dedicated service, which will not allow farm solutions. And so we had, I think it was 55 customers, big customers, that we got to roll our sleeves up with and start to dive in and help them move to the app model. And so our work with them led to a lot more samples, a lot more scenarios, and a lot more what we call solutions. So actually kind of canned approaches that these customers can use. And so these are some of the biggest customers in the world, and they're actually, believe it or not, running this code as it is today in some of these scenarios. And so it's quite interesting to see that approach. We uncovered numerous client-side object model and REST API gaps as we move through this process. Anybody who follows Vesa Yvonen's blog, he always blogs about the things that we've added to the client-side object model. And so as we found there were no way to do some particular thing, we would work with the engineers and make sure that we opened up a path forward for that. We're not done there. We'll continue to do that. So in 2015, we've actually started taking submissions from external participants. So it has turned from not just a Microsoft project to we have actually I think almost half of our pull requests now come from people outside of Microsoft. And so if you have something that you want to add, you find something very useful, but you'd like to tweak it, or you think that other people could find value of that, we actually take pull requests from the community. And so I was really happy to see us be able to do that. We also came up with what we call a core component that makes operating against SharePoint client-side object model a lot easier, kind of simplifies a lot of those tasks. And so we started releasing that as a NuGet package, and we've seen a huge amount of uptake in that, people just using that core component directly from within their Visual Studio projects. And so that's been great to see too. We started projects around remote provisioning and templating, which I'll talk a little bit about more later, because those are common scenarios that every enterprise wants to do, and everybody did it a little bit different. And so this effort was really to try to drive some consistency to that. And one of the reasons that I and the engineering team want to see that is that I can hold engineers' feet to the fire when they try to do something that's going to break one of those very common patterns, right? So that's the other thing that's really good about patterns and practices is the engineering team knows what's in there. We know when we break something like that that it's going to be impactful to the community, and we need to treat it with care. So I've been able to use the patterns and practices hammer against engineering teams quite often to make them rethink things that they were going to do, or maybe slow down and give people time. Because there is, Office 365 is an evergreen platform. It is an evolving, moving thing, much different than we've had with our on-prem releases that we just upgraded every 3 years in the past. So that's been interesting to see how we as Microsoft and you as consultants and partners start to move fast with us in that evergreen model. So having the approach that you are using represented in patterns and practices, whether you're using that code or not, gives you some level of confidence that Microsoft is not going to just yank the rug out from underneath you without a planful way forward. So I can't stress the value of that enough. And we're actually starting to see a lot of community members. And like I said, I think we've tipped the scale where half of our pull requests are now coming from the community. A lot of community members are, instead of going and writing their own IP that they actually take from customer to customer, they are just contributing back to patterns and practices to extend what's in there in the core component in some of the solutions that we have, and then using that within their customers. So that's actually a pretty interesting approach that I've seen more than one consulting company start to take. So, all right. So with that, now you know the history. It's been a long journey. It's been since 2012, and we have a lot of ramp in front of us. So it's very SharePoint focused today. I will tell you that just out front. There are some Office client samples. There are some Office 365 app samples, but for the most part it's SharePoint because that was where most of our development customization in the stack was, right? I always like to say that SharePoint was the case else of the Office development platform. You would go into an organization, you would look at what they needed that done, and if you couldn't do it in one of the other products, you would say, oh yeah, of course you can do that in SharePoint. Now, whether you should have or not, that was a different question, but because you could twist and bend SharePoint in lots of different ways, we saw that being the relief valve for a vast majority of these customers, and we saw a lot of open or highly custom development there. So you will see more and more focus now that our app model is stretching across the products and across the suite. You'll see more and more focus in patterns and practices in scenarios like the store and in scenarios like Exchange, mail calendar contacts, file APIs, Office add-ins, task panes, those types of things. So, all right, so it is much more than just code. So people who want to just geek out with code, we've got code. We got code for you. You can go code and look at code all you want. But we also have some components that the community has built up. I talked about them a little bit before. Our core component is one of them. There's also some other things we'll talk about in a little bit. And content. So there's guidance content. There are PowerPoint decks that you can use. Feel free to use if you're a partner or you're internal into an engineering organization and you're trying to get your organization to understand this, or you want to do internal training. We're trying to be 100% open for this stuff. We don't want a real high bar for entry. And as we come up with this stuff, we put it in GitHub, and people can use it. So feel free to take our decks, take our articles, take our training content, and do with it what you will. And we'll talk a little bit more about articles in a minute too, because that's actually really, really fun. So, and community. So I believe in the 4 C's, so code, components, content, and community. And the community is really where the action's at. I came into the SharePoint organization through community. Before I got into SharePoint, I was a .NET Nuke developer. I was on the iBuySpy workshop team before it became .NET Nuke. And so open source and developing with community is a very effective way of doing things. And, a lot of the folks in Silicon Valley, that's how they like to work too. I think it's a proven model, and it's really good to see Microsoft stepping up and supporting that model as well. So community. And then, again, I want to reinforce endorsed by engineering. When we get a pull request that does something very questionable, we actually have engineering team folks that'll, reject it, tell them how they should be doing it. But if we accept that stuff into the patterns and practices, engineering is aware. And so that should help you, your partners, your customers understand that gives them a little bit more confidence that the rug rug's not going to get yanked out from underneath them very quickly. And we want to provide resources for all phases of a project. Yes, devs like to geek out on code, but we know it's not just about code. It's about readiness. So again, there's some training content out there. You want to get ready, you want to get ramped up. We've recorded videos, we've done training modules and things, which I'll give you pointers to here in just a little bit. Assessments, so you're going in, you're looking at this SharePoint 2007 farm that they've deployed 942 WSPs to, and you want to understand what are you going to do with that thing and how are you going to move that to SharePoint 2013 or SharePoint 2016. There's resources there for actually doing these assessments, which is actually very nice. Planning, so once you've kind of assessed what's there and you understand what the state of the customizations are in an environment, how do you plan? And it really is, you have to break that mindset when you're transforming from what you've been doing for years and years, which is, farm solutions, maybe some sandbox solutions. Step back. A lot of these deployments are SharePoint 2007, they're SharePoint 2010. There's new features in the product that maybe you can use. Maybe you should look to convert that solution to out-of-the-box capabilities, and we see that a lot, right? So don't just look at the concrete code. Step back from it, look at what you're trying to do, and think about how you would do that in this new world of remote, working remotely against the service. And then implementation, so lots of code. We've got work in the pipe now for like ALM. How do you do good ALM around one of these projects, those types of things. And then deployment, right? So, and then how to get your farm solutions out. So if you have got a bunch of farm solutions and you're trying to convert over to this new model and use patterns and practices, then how do I actually extract all that farm solution goop, my content types, my custom list templates, all of those things can be challenging. And so we've got tools that can assist you in that space. And so there's really a lot there to whet your appetite. All right, so how to participate. So it's actually pretty easy to participate. We've tried to make it easy, and I think you can see by some of the community numbers that we have that it really is that easy. So one, join our Yammer group. So I'll leave this slide up here for a minute for folks, and I think the deck, if anybody wants it, you can let me know. I think, are they posting the decks as well? Yes, so they're posting the decks as well, so you'll be able to get it. So aka.ms, Office Dev PMP Yammer. It is the most active Yammer group in the Office 365 IT Pro network. So that just proves the success that we've had with the community and the fact that the community needed these types of resources. I think we have 3,000 or 4,000 people that actually participate in that Yammer group. So quite interesting. It is the primary vehicle that the PMP team, the core team, uses to support, answer questions, those types of things. Also, we have monthly community calls. So there's an AKAMS Office Dev PMP call. So every month you'll get to hear, maybe myself, maybe Veza Yvonen, or Frank Marasco, Bert Jensen, any of those names. You'll see leading these community calls. The core team as well as the general community. Join those calls. Anyone you can join if you just want to hear what's going on. It's a great way to just kind of get in touch with the work that the team is doing. We do monthly releases as well, and so we kind of have our monthly community call. We talk about what we released that month, and we talk about what we're working on for the next month, and so it helps kind of bring the community together with a common direction. But at the end, you can always ask questions. You can propose topics. You can let them know what you'd like to hear. All right, so let's talk a little bit about getting started. So now that you know the background, you kind of know some of the resources. You can go get in Yammer. You can start joining the community calls. How do you actually roll your sleeves up? So first, you want to get started on GitHub. And I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. So I'm not going to talk you through the screens here, but I'll actually walk you through it in a minute. But it's aka.ms/office-dev-pmp. Another way to get to it, you can just send people to dev.office.com. And then there's a patterns and practices section there, and it has links to all of this stuff straight off of dev.office.com. And so if that tells you how important both our technical marketing folks and our content publishing folks think that patterns and practices is, it gets top billing on dev.office.com. I was pretty proud of that when we got that little tab there. So, and then when you go search for code samples on dev.office.com, actually most of those samples are driven out of patterns and practices, especially on the SharePoint side. So. I have been utterly amazed at watching the growth of the Patterns and Practices GitHub repo. You can see some of the stats that we have over there. This is just over the last couple of weeks. There's 4,300 unique folks actually going out there and interacting with that GitHub repo. So quite a lot of traffic. How many people here are familiar with GitHub? A higher percentage than I've seen. All right, so it's starting to work. Don't let that intimidate you. There are ways that you can get at this code and these resources without even having to worry about how do I submit a pull request or how do I pull this code down. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit too. So the repos that we have, so we started out with just one repo in GitHub. It was myself and Veza and a guy named Bert Jensen, and we put a repo out there and we started building samples and solutions and all that kind of stuff. It has grown beyond that. So right now we have the PNP repo, and again, I'll walk you through this in the browser here in just a few minutes. We have a PNP schema repo, so everybody here, who here has developed a site provisioning solution for a customer? Oh yeah, those guys. And the rest of you, maybe you should. No, I'm kidding. It is a very common pattern that has been around since SharePoint 2007. Where you want to own that site provisioning, and so we're trying to drive a common community solution for that. And so the PNP schema really is the schema for the remote provisioning, so it's basically our XSD. There's also PNP guidance, so these are articles and topics. The great thing about this is we as a team write these articles. We write these articles in response to questions or in response to challenging scenarios that we find. We write these articles, and then our content publishing folks take those articles and they put them on MSDN, which is actually a pretty cool thing to see. Some of the things that we've written have now become official MSDN articles. And one of the main reasons we did that is we would go out and work with these customers, or we would work with partners, and they'd say, that's great that you've got something hanging around out there in an open source thing on GitHub, but if I'm going to go to my dev manager and tell him that this is what you need to do, I need to see an MSDN article. And so that work was really driven by that need from folks to have official Microsoft locations to actually point people who maybe are skeptical. So that's good to know. So the way I like to put it is, if you want the latest and greatest and the freshest off the press, then you go to GitHub and you can check the markdown pages. But if you're one of those folks who needs to see it on MSDN, it shows up there eventually. I have no commitment to timelines on that, though, so don't ask. And then there's now one called PNP Store. So there's actually, for folks distributing through the marketplace, there's a lot of things you can't necessarily do. So I will be open and honest with you. The vast majority of the approaches that we take in the general PNP is really targeted towards enterprise scenarios. So scenarios where you had development teams that were deploying farm solutions anyway. I mean, they could have torn your farms up. They had full control over everything anyway. And so a lot of the approaches we take do require a high level of trust for these apps. And so because of that, we're starting an effort now to show kind of patterns that you can take when you're operating in that store deployment scenario where you can't request full trust access. So there's a couple of things in there now, but I look for more to come there. I'm actually, so similar to like I said before, where I worked with MSIT and kind of drove that through, I'm actually working now with our store folks and with about 700 ISVs who are looking to deploy through the store. And so the outcome of those efforts will start to manifest themselves in that store repo. So we have grown. So we know that one repo is too big. It's kind of too much. It's a little hard to find what you're looking for unless you just want to take a weekend and spelunk around and get familiar. And so we're refactoring. And so I think this lands next month where we'll actually flip the switch on this. But there are going to be a new structure to our repos. And what we're doing is we've got the Patterns and Practices repo, which is really still going to be the samples and solutions and the components that we had. So that's the little snacky things that you can just go find. The PNP schema, because the provisioning schema is super, super important, and we need to separate that from the provisioning code. And then we'll have guidance, just like we have today, and we'll have the store. But then what we've done is we've broken out the PNP core. So we talked about that core component. Before, that just lived in a folder in the PNP repo, and we would build off of that. it's going to have its own repo so that we can version it independently from the other ones and put a little more rigor and control around the core component. And one of the hidden gems in there that was 100% written by a external contributor, so it doesn't even work for Microsoft, the PowerShell extensions. And so something we heard over and over and over again from the community was like IT pros would want to take these approaches or use these like our core component from within their PowerShell scripts, because there's a lot of capability there, but they wanted custom PowerShell extensions, and so the community rolled their sleeves up, and I think it was Erwin Van Hunen. The guy's a rock star. I love that guy. He rolled his sleeves up. He wrote this entire PowerShell wrapper around our core component, and so that thing's going to get top billing, and it's going to now be its own repo. So IT pros who just want to interact with SharePoint or interact with Office 365 and do things through PowerShell, you'll be able to do that as well. You can do it today, but it'll have its own repo. And then we'll have one for the O365 APIs, so standalone web apps that integrate into Office 365. We're starting to see some patterns emerge there that we would like to capture. So for both ISVs and enterprise scenarios, that's a very interesting one. And so we want to try to bring some community effort into what makes a good Office 365 app. Okay. And then there's PNP Office, which will be our Office client repo. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, task pane apps, content pane apps, those types of scenarios will be covered there. I expect, so we're working now, and we've actually, just as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, we announced our 2.0, no, when 2016 client dropped, the 2.0 version of the Office client APIs. And so the 1.1 version, you could do a lot, but the 2.0 really closes a lot of those gaps that people perceived from what they could traditionally do with COM and with Visto. And so we'll start an effort similar to what we did with the SharePoint patterns and practices to start to drive some adoption, uncover those gaps, and put great samples out there for the Office client. So now that we're all moving to this Azure Active Directory-based approach and common consent, and to be able to use the same tokens across all of the workloads, this is really going to open up a lot of scenarios where your app could be surfaced in one way within an Office client. It could be surfaced a different way within SharePoint, and you can make these pieces all work together. And then you know what? When they're in Outlook, you can have a mail app there also that pulls data from both and surfaces that within the Outlook experience. And so we really are on the cusp of having some very, very compelling information worker and productivity solutions capable, and it's going to take all of these pieces to compose them. So a lot of times I would see people build SharePoint stuff just because that's what they were familiar with, and they would drive people into SharePoint, when maybe you could just add it straight into their Outlook, give them a task pane app or a Compose app to be able to go pull data out of your line of business system, those types of things. So we're seeing a lot of interest in that from our ISVs today, and I expect the enterprises to start to pick up on that soon. So the restructuring is really to kind of clean up what we have today and to set us on a good path for the future so that it makes it a little more discoverable, a little easier for us to both manage and for you to contribute to the right areas. So I talked a little bit about our MSDN articles there before. If you want to get to all of the MSDN articles that have come out of our patterns and practices efforts, there's a link there for that. So you have aka.ms, Office Dev PNP MSDN. I argue that's not actually a short URL, but it's somewhat easy to remember. At least we camel cased it, right? So this, the content is submitted, as I said before, to the guidance repo, and then it's published on MSDN as official guidance. So again, if you've got one of those folks who says, hey, it has to be on MSDN or I'm not going to believe you, you can wait for it to be on MSDN, all right? What I've seen is about a month and a half lag from the time we get these things into GitHub until they show up out there. But there could be differences. We have actually a very small and agile content publishing organization now, is how I like to put it. And so they kind of make pushes at it. So, but we do take pull requests for this repo just like we do for the code, right? So if you have an idea for an article, if you want to suggest a change in an article to clarify something that maybe your customers keep stumbling on, you can absolutely just suggest the change there, and eventually it'll end up on MSDN. And we, in the community calls, in our monthly newsletters, on the homepage of both dev.office.com and in our GitHub wiki, we absolutely give recognition to the community members who are contributing. And so if you're one of those independent consultants like I was before I joined Microsoft, and your brand is actually what helps you sell your business, being attached to the Patterns and Practices effort really does help elevate that brand. And so we've seen a lot of community contribution and community participation just for that reason. So help us improve. Everybody likes to complain about the documentation. First they like to complain about the software, then they like to complain about the documentation. Help us improve it as a community. Tell us where we can improve. And if you want videos, if you're the kind of person who wants to just maybe do lunch and learns with your team and watch some videos while you're brown bagging it, we have Channel 9 videos here. So if you go to aka.ms Office Dev PNP videos, we have plenty of videos up there for you. We also publish all the recordings of our monthly community calls. So I know in New Zealand, and I have lived this firsthand this week, we don't often schedule things at times that are conducive to you folks. I have been up at 3 a.m. every day this week for calls in Redmond. Yes. So we do post the recordings of these if you can't join. But if we start to get a great community down here in Australia and New Zealand, we could start to look to do these calls in time zone appropriate ways, and maybe we could wrangle Wayne into like organizing it or something. Yeah. And also, there's some content on Microsoft Virtual Academy. So myself, Vezi Uvonen, Richard Dizarega, we all recorded a bunch of Microsoft Virtual Academy. They are targeted towards transforming SharePoint code, but if you go in there to MVA and you search for transform SharePoint code, hint, hint, every bit of that was PNP code that we actually showed off. So it's another great resource if you're kind of that visual learner and you like to see the videos. All right, so now I'm going to, and I call this a demo. It's really just me showing you where things are at in the browser. For this part, I am going to flip over to my machine here. And, whoa, I've never seen it do that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that worked. Thanks, though. So first, as I said before, dev.office.com, if you go to resources and you go to patterns and practices, very easy. You can see here we've got links off to our samples, our scenarios, our solutions, and our guidance. You can find out a little bit about it. You can see pictures of really ugly dudes that have contributed in the past. And then there's a lot of information here around the Yammer group. We really tried to take all of that I gave you in the first few slides about where these resources are and surface that everywhere so that everybody can understand where to get to this. And actually, as of the last couple of months, my team, I actually have an engineering team that owns this entire dev.office.com platform. So if we want to make changes, we can make changes. Anyway. So we also have news, themes. We've got recent samples. And then here's, like I said, we're calling out the folks who actually contributed these samples. And actually, look at there, 1, 2, 3, 4. These 5 samples, none of those are Microsoft people. These are all community folks that we have worked with. So, and then you can get links to our monthly updates, training resources, recent videos, guidance and documentation. There's a huge amount of information here for folks who aren't familiar. And then again, I'll actually show code samples. So if you go to dev.office.com code samples, when you filter for some of these, so if you go to SharePoint, or wait, wrong one. If I want to do SharePoint, let's say taxonomy, no code samples, hold on. Something's wrong here. There we go, SharePoint. And you'll see that we have a mixture of code samples that are from MSDN, from Code Gallery, but then there's patterns and practices samples sprinkled throughout here as well. Yeah, So when you find one of those, it basically just links you off into our GitHub repo. So I'm going to jump off over into GitHub. For those of you who are familiar with GitHub, this might be a little boring, but there's a lot out here. So the Office Dev organization is actually totally committed to open source where it makes sense. One of the other projects that I just finished working with the teams on was the Office UI Fabric. Who here knows what the Office UI Fabric is? So in 3 days, that thing surpassed the Patterns and Practices repo as the most liked repo in our GitHub organization. It's a set of components and styles and things that you can use in your apps to actually make it look just like Office and SharePoint. So super, we heard from the community that they wanted that. They were tired of building everything themselves. They were tired of having their add-ins not quite look like Office, not look professional. So that's actually out here. It's not Patterns and Practices, but it's just something I'm proud of. Office UI Fabric, and you can see just in the days since it's been released, it's had 989 likes and 90 forks. Patterns and Practices itself was the previous winner. It had 569 likes and 910 forks, though, if that gives you an idea of how many people are actually actively working on this project. There's quite a lot of actual contribution. I mean, you always have that kind of, they used to call it 80-20 rule. In open source, it's the 90-10 rule. So about 10% of people that actually interact with your repo are going to ever contribute back. That's what I've seen personally. Most people are lurkers. Most people are just trying to grab your code. It's open source. It's shared. It's not stealing. Everybody can have it. We can make as many copies as we want. But there's a lot, and you can see that we've got like our SDK for Java, our XML Power Tools, and lots of little samples that our content publishing organization puts out. And people get confused. They say, well, you have samples and Patterns and Practices, but then I see those sample repos. What's the difference between those two? And the way that I like to put it is, our engineering organization and our content publishing organization, we release what we think you want, and it's never exactly what you want. Patterns and Practices really is what the community needed, right? So you took what we released, you stitched together the different pieces of it, and then we said, here's something that every customer seems to be doing. That's what ends up in Patterns and Practices. So Patterns and Practices really is by the community, for the community. We just actually have some Microsoft folks that are stewarding that effort. So don't get confused that there's two types of samples. You'll see samples that are officially published. We release a new feature. We're going to publish a few samples that show you how to interact with that feature. But then maybe Patterns and Practices says, that new feature goes really well in our remote site provisioning solution, so we're going to add it to the schema. We're going to add it to the code. Maybe we expose it in the core component. Those types of things will start to happen, right? So there's still value for both. But if you look at the PnP repo itself, you'll see that we have assemblies, binaries, components. There's our guidance, some guidance, but that's actually moved. So you can see we have notes there. There's a core component. The real meat is in these three folders: samples, scenarios, and solutions. And today we're going to, because it's a 200-level session and I'm really just trying to get you guys familiar and started, we're going to focus on samples. Before we dive into that folder and navigate around, I'm going to point out a couple of things. So just like we did on dev.office.com, where we had a nice write-up and links to everything, if you scroll down into our README, it gives you a high-level overview, and then you can go into our project wiki. So we've got a project wiki that's got lots and lots of information, links to our roadmap, links to things like unit testing has been top of mind for folks, and so there's some pages in there for that. Talk a little bit about our structure and approach. So a lot of the things that I'm talking to you about today, you can go read up here on the wiki. And again, we take pull requests, so if you see where I misspelled something or anything like that, feel free to correct it. And then we have an FAQ for the top running issues, or top questions that we see, okay? So go back just a second. For those of you who don't want to, are scared or intimidated by GitHub, or you just don't want to mess with actually trying to set up a repo or clone it or fork it or anything, one, it's easy to clone. You can do it right there. But you can just download the zip code, the zip file. So if you go to one of these repos, you can click Download Zip. It'll package up the whole thing as it is at that current time. into a big zip file. You can extract it onto your machine, and use it as you see fit. So we actually see a lot of people doing that, and that's okay. All right, so I'm going to show you, like if you go into samples, there's a ton of samples in here. Now, what the samples are really intended, at first it was transformation topics. So you used to do this in your farm solutions or in your full trust code. Here's how you would do that in the new app model. So the vast majority of these are kind of that approach, but we're seeing more and more as we release new features, we'll see samples that the Patterns and Practices team puts together. And we're even starting to see some interesting ones, little business apps, little chat room app that's built with SignalR, some things that the community has found very interesting. So I'm going to actually show you guys 2 samples. I'm going to show you, and I'm going to not jump back to my deck and come back. I want you to understand that 2 things. One, these samples are really, really easy to get started with. All you need is an Office 365 developer tenant. You can run it against on-prem as well, but it's really, really easy if you just do it with an Office 365 tenant, either a developer site collection or your own developer tenant. This is the project structure for one particular sample. So what this sample does is it injects a second level of navigation into the SharePoint UI. So maybe you want to have a common navigation across all of your sites. That's a pretty standard requirement, isn't it, in a SharePoint implementation? You would have to hack the master page, or I'd say hack, unghost your master page and modify it previously, which does present some challenges in Office 365, and so we'd like to steer people away from that. But all I had to do is I pulled this sample down. I clicked on the actual manifest project. So this is a provider-hosted application, and so I have the app project here, which has my manifest, and then I have my provider here. This app project here, all you have to do is come down here and set what your site URL is. So wherever your developer site collection that you're developing against, you will set that, and you can F5 it. That's it. That's all you have to do for these samples. Okay? So I'm going to F5 this. And it is going against a tenant in the US, so not only did I get to experience firsthand the pain of the 8 o'clock in the morning Redmond calls, I am also getting to experience firsthand the bouncing all the way to Redmond to get resources from the internet problem. So anyway, so it takes a little bit longer, but it still wasn't too bad. So we've got secondary navigation. It actually shows you a page here. It walks you through what the steps are to run the sample, and it gives you some notes. And so basically all I'm going to do is I'm going to say inject the second level navigation. It will actually go, so this is a provider-hosted app. It's actually calling with CSOM. It's adding a user custom action with a custom JavaScript file into the site. I'll show you guys the code here in a second. And then you can see that it popped up and said, hey, the second level navigation has been applied to the host web. If I open the host web up, I could also navigate by going back to the site, but I'm going to want to come back here. You can see that I injected 2 links there, intranet tools, right? I mean, you could make a flyout menu, but the general pattern that we use there is one that's very, very, very useful, right? I did not have to unghost the master page. So that means when they make changes in Office 365 and they add a new whiz-bang control, Wayne back there escalated 2 different customers to me when we rolled out the app launcher, and it broke their master pages. So we don't try to do that often in Office 365, but in an evergreen service, there's always that risk. I mean, we can't. Would you pay us for a service that is never going to change? Maybe. Will you be happier if that service adds new features over time? Absolutely. And so we're trying to find a nice way to work with folks to give them the kinds of customizations that they need, but do it in a way that allows us to innovate in the service and not have those types of breaking changes problems. So again, very simple sample, but you can see how easy it is to actually get started. And then I actually have a button here that says remove the second level navigation. And so it calls back out using client-side object model and actually removes the JavaScript that was put into the site and then removes the custom action that was set. So it has been removed. If I click the host web here, you can see now I'm working on it. My navigation is gone. Okay? So you'll see a lot of those, and I've got one more. So people like to say, well, I don't like the new app model or the add-in model because all I can do is app parts. No, that's not right. And if that's what you're thinking, you need to expand your mind a little bit. The way that we've been positioning over the last year, which I think is resonating a little better, is the app model is two things. It's add-ins, which light up within the experience of the products, so be it SharePoint or the Office client or Exchange, Outlook. And then there's extensions, which is really just any kind of remote process that is interacting with our API surface, right? So SharePoint has always been a very flexible platform, but you were injecting your code into the worker process, which has its own drawbacks. And if you're running a financially backed SLA in a large cloud service, meaning I'm going to give you money back if your service has problems, letting you inject .NET code into our worker process is not only risky from a stability perspective, it is also costly to us from a cost perspective and frustrating to you. And so we really want you to take these remote approaches, so use these extension approaches if the add-in model doesn't work for you. And so one of the crafty, I think somebody said that Veza and I flew very loose with the idea of the app model, and this is an example of that. We call this an app script part, okay? So what this is an approach that allows you, and I'm just going to F5 this sample as well. It's an approach. We are actually going to inject a web part into the web part gallery, and all it is putting a div on the page, and then we're sticking some JavaScript in the page that looks for that div and then builds it out client side. So it's not an app part. So now it's not in an iframe. So it can do things with the host web pages, which is what the main complaint with the app parts is. The app parts were built to be isolated, right? There was a security goal and a design goal there to provide isolation for the store scenario. ISV that you don't trust, ISV that you don't know, you probably don't want them running code inside the host web because, I don't know, maybe your CEO navigates there and then they grab all his OneDrive documents and then begin insider trading, right? So that the app webs and the app parts were really built to provide that level of security for that scenario where you can't fire the developer, is what I like to say. Because if it's your internal developers that are building farm solutions, you do have some recourse if they look to do those kinds of things. So what this one does, I'm going to run this scenario. You can see it creates an app script part and uploads some JavaScript. So I'm going to run it. And then I'm going to go to the host web. And then I'll edit this page. I'm going to click over here, and I am going to insert a web part. So it's not an app part. We actually uploaded a web part definition. We called it the user profile information app script part there. So we created a category. We've got a part. I'm going to add that. One of the most common complaints, and then you can see it came up on the page, and then the JavaScript filled it out after the page rendered. And so I'm going to save this. One of the most common complaints, besides the isolation that the app part provides when it's inside of an iframe, is I cannot resize that thing. You cannot create responsive designs. You cannot create designs that work in multiple screen sizes. Look at this. It's resizing by itself. I know that seems like such a small thing, but we got very violent feedback about the app web, about the app parts from that, and we're working on some interesting things in the future there. So with that, I'm going to cut back over to the slide deck. and we will talk a little bit about, so I already did those demos, so some of the more complex solutions. So the things I showed you are very, very simple, right? There's tons and tons of little samples, so maybe you need to know how to attach a workflow to the host web. Maybe you need to know how to, I don't know, I can't even remember, get Azure AD profile properties. All of those types of things, we show little small samples on how to do that. But we actually have some very interesting, what we like to call more complex solutions. Those are in the solutions folders. Timer jobs. So kind of everybody in the world puts timer jobs on their SharePoint forms. You can't do that in Office 365. We're not going to let you do that in Office 365. 2 reasons. 1, it's .NET code running on our service. 2, it runs under the farm account. This is a multi-tenant service, so you would be able to get to everyone else's data. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So the approach that we've been taking is actually use a provider-hosted app, use the APIs that we provide, and interact with SharePoint in that manner. And we also came up with, because that approach can cause things like timeouts, or especially when you're doing site provisioning. So one of the most common patterns that we've seen, I need to provision custom sites. I want to do custom self-service site provisioning. We have a timeout of, I think, a minute in Azure, and so if the operation takes longer than that. So one of the patterns that we have in there, and we actually have lots and lots of code to show you this, it's really, really cool, is you have a provider-hosted add-in. So runs the add-in functionality. So let's say I'm asking it to provision a site collection, right? It drops it in a storage queue in Azure. The storage queue runs a web job. The web job actually has the logic that's needed to actually call into SharePoint. And so you can do really high throughput operations that are maybe burstable or things like that, but then let the storage queue and the web job take care of doing that asynchronously after the fact. And maybe just, that's what we do inside Microsoft. We have a thing called auto sites for creating sites. You go create the site, and if it doesn't create very quickly, because I don't know if you guys know this, but sometimes in SharePoint Online it takes a while to create a site collection. If it doesn't create within the first, I think, 30, 45 seconds, it says, hey, we're going to send you an email when this thing's complete. You can go ahead and close this dialog and keep doing your work. And then you'll get an email in your box once that web job's completed and the site's created that says, hey, here's a link to your site. So it allows people to not sit there and just wait and wait and wait for, however long the provisioning queue in SharePoint Online is backed up. And the most exciting thing, and oh my gosh, my slide is, okay. The most exciting thing, and the one that I am super proud of the team about, is the site provisioning framework. So it's actually a reusable framework that you can use to create your own remote site provisioning solution. Anybody here know what SaveSite as a template is? Have you used it? Okay, have you used it successfully over a long period of time? Nobody else's hand went up except one like that. There's a notable number of problems with SaveSite as a template. What we looked to do here was actually remediate some of those problems. You can actually create a site to use as a template site. So you go create your lists, your libraries, your content types, all of the things that you want that site to have. And then you can extract that site as a template. And we even have, because we're software geeks, we did like a provider model with connectors. So you can persist it in Azure Blob Store or in a file system in XML or somewhere else. And then later, you can actually use that template. You can provision a site, and then you can basically just say target.web.apply provisioning template and give them the template you want to use. And it will take all of those customizations that you did for that original site, and it will apply them onto the site that you created. So super, super, super interesting capability. What we're working on now is Delta changes. So you would actually be able to go make changes to site A, run this again. It would gen a diff between the original template and that template, and then it would go apply those changes onto all of the sites that had been provisioned off of that template. So super, super common scenario. We heard it over and over again. I've seen literally thousands of different approaches to this. 20 of them were probably good. So no, I jest, but I have seen some approaches to this that I went, ooh, don't do that. And actually, I'm a little jaded because in my capacity in the customer advisory team, no happy customers landed there. and Neil knows this. So I would always get the, not so happy customers. Got a question in the back. We are actively exploring within engineering what we want to do with that scenario. I can't share more details yet, but there's active work going on within engineering to figure out what we want to do there. And for the recording, he was asking, would we be able to replace the save site as template option with this type of an approach? And I think we already recorded my answer. So hopefully we'll be able to share more, I think, this fall or maybe early in the spring on what we're thinking there. But some of the things about SaveSite as a template that are known problematic, I can't. And lesson number 3, the question was, is that Northern Hemisphere fall? Yes, it is. So that would be your spring and maybe into your summer. All right. So in closing, because I think I'm running, I'm actually doing all right. I'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So in closing, we talked about the history of the program. We gave you an overview. We kind of showed you how to get started with the different resources that are out there, showed you how to be able to participate, showed you a couple of samples, and then teased you with some of the more complex scenarios that are in there. You can do your homework and check those out yourself. So with that, I've got about 3 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions from folks. I'm just going to leave this up on the slide deck. There's some other sessions that you may find interesting. So with that, any questions? Microsoft Project. So I have been getting some questions around that here lately. I would love to see if you have requests for things that we could do with Microsoft Project. Enter them in the issues list in GitHub, or you can go into the Yammer group, and we'd love to have that conversation with you. So there are some folks on the Microsoft Project team who would be willing to engage there. So, any other questions? All right. Oh, one more. Did I have to change the name of my talk? Yes. Yes, I had to change the name of my talk. I submitted it as 0 to 60, but the feedback I got was, that's pretty darn slow. So we went to 100 kilometers per hour. So yes, good observation. All right. Well, thank you. I will be up here for maybe 10 or 15 minutes afterwards if you guys want to ask some one-on-one questions or just have discussion. But with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.